Welcome into our Bible study. Today, in our Bible study series, we are in 1 Chronicles chapter 12. We're going to take a step back in time in the life of David. Free PDF, the same PDF that you're seeing up on the screen that I'm reading off of, all my notes are on. That's available on the website for free. You can download it. Let's talk about our timeline. Now, as we mentioned several times, the book of 1 Chronicles was written several hundred years after the life of David, but it documents the life of David, particularly the reign of David, a little bit before that. But David's reign lasted from about 1055 to 1015 BC. Now, chapter 12 is going to take a step back in time from the previous chapter. It's going to document David's time in Ziklag. Ziklag you'll see on the map just above the area of Simeon. We'll get there in just a second. David lived in Ziklag when he was hiding from King Saul, because King Saul was always trying to kill him. That brings us to our characters section. Of course, we have David, who's the second king over all of Israel and Judah. Before him, his predecessor was Saul. He was the first king, and he was anointed by the prophet Samuel to take on that job. And then David's band of fighting men. During the reign of Saul, a reasonably large group of Israelite men deserted from Saul and joined David, because Saul wasn't the best king. And they formed quite a sizable army that was under David's personal command. Now let's go over to our map. Just above the territory of Simeon, down towards the bottom of the map, you'll see the town of Ziklag, city of Ziklag. When David was on the run, he went to Ziklag, which was actually a Philistine-controlled city, and he got some safety from Saul there so that Saul couldn't do him in. The Israelite men met in Hebron to appoint David king. Hebron's not too far from Ziklag in the territory of Judah. David eventually would move to Jerusalem and make that his capital. Okay, now we can tackle our outline. The first section is verses 1 through 22. David's fighting force grows while he's on the run from Saul. So when David was fleeing for his life from Saul, men from several tribes joined up with him. They gave their allegiance to David, and they promised that they were going to fight for him, ultimately to make him king. And many of these people knew that God had chosen David to be the next king and that Samuel had anointed him to be the next king of Israel. When he lived in Ziklag, he was joined by a group of Benjaminites, and they're described as archers and slingers who could sling stones with both hands. And this is quite significant, quite a talent. It also shows us that when David faced Goliath with the sling, that was a respected weapon at that time. A lot of times you see pictures of David out here with this little child slingshot when this story is illustrated. But no, the sling was an actual weapon. And some very skilled slingers joined David, which would have certainly been an asset to him. A group of Gadites also joined David when he was in the stronghold. Now, exactly which stronghold that is, the location is somewhat debated. The men were described this way: mighty and experienced warriors, whose faces were like the faces of lions and who were swift as gazelles upon the mountains. The least was a match for 100 men, and the greatest for 1,000. That's verses 8 through 14. These are the men that I want fighting on my team. Other groups from Judah, Benjamin, and Manasseh joined up with David, and verse 22 tells us this, quote, "For from day to day men came to David to help him until there was a great army, like an army of God." The second half of the chapter, verses 23 through 40, is about Israel gathering to make David their king. This section skips forward about 7.5 years. Remember, I mentioned we went back in time to talk about David at Ziklag. Now we're skipping forward 7.5 years to when David was appointed king, finally, over all of Israel and Judah. Warriors from all over the nation gathered in Hebron to swear their allegiance to their new king. And verses 24 through 37 record the tribes and the commanders and how many warriors they brought with them to this kingly appointment. They brought flour, fig cakes, raisin, wine, oil, oxen, and sheep, and they spent 3 days feasting with David. So there you go, 1 Chronicles chapter 12. Now, our application section to finish off this study. God's people aren't always the ones that society is really interested in claiming. They're often the outcasts and the people on the fringes of society. 2 Samuel chapter 22, verse 2, which is a parallel to this chapter, says this about the men who came to join up with David. Quote, "And everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was bitter in soul gathered to him, and he became commander over them. And there were with him about 400 men." So David's men were deserters, they were rebels, they were debtors, but God was still going to use them to bring about his ultimate will, and that was to bring David to the throne. So they were on the fringes of society, but you know what? The same was true for many of the people who accepted Jesus' preaching. They were often sick, distressed in some way, poor, and not respected by what people would consider proper society. So for application for us, if you are forming a team to undertake some kind of work in the kingdom of God, it would be a mistake to overlook the people who are on the fringes. People who are on the fringes are often more open to letting God lead them and giving God the credit for future success. People who are traditionally qualified for a role have a tendency to think that if God's work is going to be accomplished, it's going to be accomplished because they are capable, because of their qualifications, rather than because of God's capability. So don't overlook those who are often overlooked by the world. God doesn't look at people the same way that men do.